Mendel's life is full of hardships, especially during his student years. It was in 1838 when Mendel's father had a severe injury in the forest. It meant that he couldn't work anymore, and so that the family couldn't support Mendel anymore. Mendel was at this time at the grammar school in Opava studying there, and he had to make a living since he was 16. So he started to teach his less talented classmates, but the income was kind of merged. It meant that he didn't have much money. Mendel fell ill from distress, and he had to spend some time with his parents in Hinčice, in the village where he was born. Mendel then continued his studies at the Philosophical Institute in Olomouc. This time the situation was a bit different because in Olomouc it was spoken in Czech mostly, and Mendel didn't speak Czech very much, so he had less pupils, less students, and also less money. And Mendel fell ill from distress and uncertain future, and had to interrupt his studies. He spent 1 year at home again, and at that time it was his sister Theresia who helped him a lot, because she gave up part of her dowry to support Mendel so that Mendel could finish his studies in Olomouc. And Mendel paid this favor back later when he became an abbot in 1868. So after Mendel finished his studies in Olomouc, he came to Brno at the recommendation of his professor Friedrich Franz, who recommended Mendel for his excellent results and talent, but also for his solid character. The Augustinian Abbey was a really center of European education of that time. It was an example of a rich church institution which combined the tradition with education, scholarship and knowledge. Mendel was received in the Abbey by Abbot Knapp. He was a very important figure of that time in Brno. He was a theologist, a naturalist and also orientalist. And I would say he was a key person in Mendel's life. He was some kind of mentor and supported Mendel in his experiments and studies. Other monks included Tomáš Bratránek, another teacher and philosopher who later became a rector of the university in Krakow. Then there was philosopher and journalist Matouš Klácer, or the music composer Pavel Křížovský, who was a conductor of the church choir as well. So this Brno Abbey provided really stimulating and influential background and environment for Mendel. So after Mendel finished his theological studies, he became a chaplain in Brno parish, and it meant that he had to visit the sick and dying people. But this caused troubles because, again, his illness manifested itself, and Mendel fell ill again. He suffered a collapse and had to recover for 4 months. It was again Abbot Knapp who supported Mendel in his change and sent Mendel to Znojmo, where Mendel became an assistant teacher. And this was a very nice period in Mendel's life because he really loved teaching and he was very popular with his students and fellow teachers. However, to become a proper teacher, Mendel was supposed to take an exam at the Vienna University. However, he failed because probably self-study for the exam. So then it was decided by Abbot Knapp that Mendel would go to Vienna University to study, and he happened to study with such experts there, for example, Christian Doppler or Franz Unger. It's also important to know that it was in Vienna where Mendel learned new methods of mathematics like combinatorics and statistics, which he later used in his experiments with plant hybrids. However, Mendel failed also his final exam, and it meant that he had to come back to Brno, and he was very depressed from this failure. But however, we could see it now as a lucky moment in his life, lucky moment for today's genetics and science, because Mendel started to devote himself fully to his experiments after he came back from Vienna. And it was in the Augustinian Abbey in the garden where he grew up to 27,000 pea plants. He was again very supported by Abbot Knapp, who had a new greenhouse built in the Abbey's garden. So Mendel presented the results of his experiments at the Nature Research Society in 1865. But at this time, actually, nobody understood what he was talking about. It was probably because his talk and writing was full of mathematics, and the biologists of that time didn't understand. He just was ahead of his time. The publication was also sent to several institutions in Europe and libraries, but again, nobody replied and understood what Mendel was talking about. Nevertheless, he was a well-known meteorologist of the time. Only few people probably know that Mendel was the first person in the world who described scientifically a tornado which hit Brno in 1870. Then Mendel became an abbot. It was in 1868, and from this time he had less time for his experiments because he had to devote to the administrative of the abbey and also a long dispute of the monastery text. This actually took a lot of energy of Mendel's, and it really exhausted him at the end of his life. Mendel died of kidney failure in 1884, and when he died, nobody actually remembered him as the founder of the principles of inheritance, but they remembered a generous abbot, they remembered a keen beekeeper, popular teacher, and a meteorologist. It was only at the beginning of the 20th century in 1900 when three scientists in Europe, Hugo de Vries, Karl Correns and Erich von Czermak, independently discovered the same what Mendel did in 1865. They knew Mendel, and they agreed that Mendel was the first to discover the principles, and they called him father of genetics and the founder of genetics, this dynamic science which influences all of our lives.